Welcome everybody to this webinar of the RAI's Committee for Anthropology of Policy and Practice. This is a bit of housekeeping at the start to get you oriented. And for those of you who don't know the Royal Anthropological Institute yet, we are a UK-based learned society promoting the understanding of anthropology. And we run currently weekly events online and also conferences, symposiums, and a film festival. So if you would like to support us in going on with those activities, please do consider supporting us in some way. For example, you could become a fellow. There's many benefits to that. My colleague Amanda is going to put a link in the chat that leads you to more information. So we have a film festival coming up. You should be seeing that now, yes. Which is going online for the first time this time. And it's actually starting next week, Friday. So there's lots going on during 10 days. You can watch 80 films and see many presentations and live events and talks. And then later this year in October, we are holding a major interdisciplinary conference on anthropology and conservation with a strong focus on Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous rights. Our main co-organizer is the University of East Anglia's School of International Development. And besides them, we also have as co-organizers the University of Kent's School of Anthropology and Conservation, the Forest Peoples Programme, the Linnean Society, Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, the Anthropology and Environment Society, which is a section of the AAA, Botanic Garden Conservation International, and the Society of Ethnobiology. So many interesting organizations and institutions co-organizing with us. And the call for panels is currently still open. It closes tomorrow on the 12th. So if you still have a great idea for a panel, please be in touch and we'll put a link in the chat for that as well. I'm going to hand over now to our chair, Emma Crewe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Haneen. And thank you to Haneen, Amanda, and Rich for organising the event. So the event is hosted by the Committee on Policy of Practice at the RAI. So we're interested in really promoting the influence of anthropology amongst policymakers and practitioners. And this series, which is called Anthropology Communicates, is about anthropologists' experiences of communicating with policymakers and practitioners. And we've got another one next month on the 8th of April, which is being led by Alex Clegg, and that one is about civil society. So please do check the website because they happen pretty much monthly. And so that's our series. So today, I'm really, really delighted to welcome Dame Sue Black, who is many things, including President of the RAI, Professor of Anatomy and Forensic Anthropology, Pro-Vice-Chancellor at Lancaster University. I haven't got time to tell you all the other posts she's held, but I am really delighted that she's going to be a member of the House of Lords because they are one of my group of informants. And so I really look forward to conversations about what it's like being an anthropologist in Parliament. So today, Sue's going to talk about forensic anthropology, no longer a cowboy. Thank you so much for making time for this, Sue. And I just want to say that Sue will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to take a 5-minute break. And then when we come back, you're really welcome to either put up your hand and ask your question yourself or put it in the chat and I'll put it to Sue. So can I hand over to you, Sue?
Thank you very much indeed. And hello to everybody wherever you are around the world. And I'm hoping that somebody will be able to tell me that you can see my presentation shared.
We do.
We do. Thank you very much indeed. Well, it is a real pleasure, and thank you to Emma and to everyone else. It has been a real joy for me to be the president of the RAI, because when our discipline was looking to find its way forward in policy, it was the RAI who came to our assistance. And it has become such an important home for our discipline in the UK that to be a president of it is a sheer and utter joy. Now, As I suppose you expect, when we're going to talk about forensic anthropology, I do have to give a little bit of a health warning that says that some of the images that you might see might be distressing, but they're not here to entertain you. They're here to literally help us understand the discipline. And if you at any point do feel uncomfortable with some of the images that you'll see, and it'll only be in the very early stages of what I want to talk to you about, then I will not be in the least little bit offended if you hit the button and decide that you need to go away somewhere else rather than listen to this. But it is important that you know that some of these images may be challenging for some of us. So, forensic anthropology, I shouldn't need in this audience really to tell you how it's come about, but it does come from two very important words, the forensic part and the anthropology part. And the forensic part really just simply means that we're expert witnesses to the court. And of course, you can be a forensic anthropologist through the sociocultural, through the archaeological, or through the linguistic elements, because it isn't solely through biological. But forensic anthropology has come to mean the study of the human, or what remains of the human, for medico-legal investigations. And those individuals who've come in to study this subject tend to come in through one of two routes. They either come through the anthropology route, that is often through biological anthropology, and then through physical anthropology, and sometimes through osteology as well, but sometimes coming in also from the archaeological side, where we have the osteoarchaeology. But there are a small group of individuals who come in from the anatomical side as well. And I think that's a really important route, because although much of what we may study may relate to the skeleton and the human skeleton, being able to understand all of the structures that surround it, so whether it is muscle and it is nerves and it is blood vessels, all of those add a 3-dimension to the human body. And so you'll find that forensic anthropologists will come in generally in the UK through one of those two routes. If you're overseas, then in some parts of the world, to come into the forensic anthropology route, you need to be medically qualified. And we don't require that in the UK. But these are our two most common routes. What I want to think about today is that when we're trying to understand where we're going with a subject, in reality, as Maya Angelou said, and said it so much better than ever I could, you can't really know where you're going until you know where you've been. And this importance of an establishment within your discipline, knowing where you've come from, knowing what your history is like, gives you that pedigree to allow you to move forward into where you want to go. And when you get as old as I am, what you're able to do in life is to stop for a moment and to turn around and look at the path that's been trod, to identify where those signposts were in time, where decisions were made, where things happened. And you can then, with hindsight, which is a wonderful thing, be able to map the path of your own discipline or your own self for that matter. So I'm going to do a little bit of that today. I want to be able to talk to you about where forensic anthropology is in the UK now, but you can't do that without knowing where it's come from. And one of the probably most important cases that identified the development of forensic anthropology in the UK, and this is a tremendous coincidence for me, given that I'm now at the University of Lancaster, occurred in Lancaster. And it occurred in Lancaster in 1935. Buck Ruxton was a medic, and he trained in medicine in India, came over to London, didn't do too well in the surgeon's exams in London, and thought that he could probably do better if he went up to Edinburgh and did his surgeon's exams in Edinburgh. Well, he failed there 3 times as well. But when he was in Edinburgh, he met Isabella. And Isabella was working as a manageress in a restaurant. And they got together as a couple. She thought of him as being this terribly exotic and charming man, as indeed he was to most individuals. They moved down to London. She was pregnant. She had in fact been married before. And in moving to London, they could reinvent themselves. And so they invented themselves as a married couple, and she took his name. So Buck Ruxton and his wife Isabella were a very, very charming couple, and they were the host of their society. He had aspirations though. He didn't like being a small fish in a big pond. He wanted to be a big fish in a small pond. And he was offered the opportunity to work in Lancaster. And this is at a time, of course, long before we have the National Health Service. And as a GP, what he could do is he could set up his own practice. And both he and Isabella became incredibly well known within the area and great socialites. People thought they were tremendous company. He was a very respected GP. And in fact, his cleanliness and his attention to managing infection was so successful that he had an incredibly low rate of fetal-maternal mortality. When women were dying in childbirth, Buck Ruxton was often viewed as being somebody who really understood how to look after these women and to help to deliver them safely of their babies. So he became really, really very popular. Because Lancaster at the time was such a poor and impoverished part of the country in the Northwest, often his clients couldn't afford to pay him. And he would take them in and he would not charge them because it was more important to him that he looked after his patients than in fact he got rich. He liked the approbation. He liked the fact that people liked him. And on the surface, Buck Ruxton and Isabella had an absolutely idyllic life. They had a lovely large house in 2 Dalton Square in Lancaster. To everybody externally, they were a very happy married couple. They had 3 children together. She was a bit independent. She would quite like to have run her own business. And both of them had their own cars, which was quite unusual for a woman, certainly at that time as well. Because she was so busy and he was so busy, they took in a maid, somebody who would help them to look after the children and to help run the business. And that was Mary Rogerson. And Mary was a young woman from Morecambe, and Morecambe is just 3 or 4 miles down the road from Lancaster. What started to happen though was that Buck Ruxton started to become a little bit anxious and a little bit jealous of his wife. He viewed her not as being a great beauty, but he was jealous of people who found her very alluring and very attractive. And so we started to see the marriage break down. And he would accuse her of being unfaithful in their marriage. We're not quite sure exactly what happened, but we have a fairly good idea. Isabella went off to Blackpool one Saturday evening with her sisters to go and watch the Blackpool illuminations, back there even in 1935. And Isabella knew that Buck Ruxton was a little bit worried and jealous, so she didn't stay over in Blackpool. She came home, but she didn't come home till 1 o'clock in the morning. And by that point, Buck Ruxton was absolutely convinced that she was having an extramarital affair. We believe that when she came into the house, he either strangled her or he bludgeoned her to death with a poker. We're not quite sure which. At that point, we suspect Mary Rogerson came out of her room, hearing the kerfuffle, and Mary was murdered as well. So Buck Ruxton was now facing a situation where he had 3 sleeping children in his house, and he had 2 murdered women. What we believe he did was he took both of their bodies into the bathroom, and because he was a surgeon, he was incredibly skilled at being able to dismember their bodies. And so what he did was he dismembered them into at least 70 different pieces. He probably dismembered Isabella first, and then we know that he managed to cut his hand, and probably because his scalpels were getting blunt at that point. And in having cut his hand, he was then impeded. And so his dismemberment of Mary was not as efficient and effective as his dismemberment of Isabella. He was exhausted after a few hours of doing this. And so what he did is he locked the bathroom door. In the morning, he told the children that Isabella and Mary weren't home, and he took the children off to a friend to look after them for the day. He started to tell people that Isabella had left him. He started to tell people that Mary had gone away because she'd had a pregnancy and Isabella was looking after her. And so he started to tell lies. And people were a bit confused about what was going on, but he was a respected doctor. And so they weren't in any way going to question him. So we have a situation where probably over about 2 or 3 days, he finished off the dismemberment of both bodies. He then hired a car, and in that car, he drove north. And he drove north to an area in Morphed, which is over the border into Scotland. And in the top left, you can see the police officers looking into the burn at Morphed. And in the bottom left one, you can see that it became really quite a draw and a magnet when somebody looking over the bridge at one point thought they saw a hand sticking out of the water. And so the police were called. The police from Morphed arrived on their bicycles, which I think is marvelous. And they started to find these pieces of body around the burn in Morphed. We believe that what he had done was he had driven up to this bridge, he'd thrown over parcels of the body parts, which were wrapped in clothing and were wrapped in newspapers. And it was those newspapers that were going to be his ultimate undoing. And what we see here is one of the senior police officers carrying a bag, and inside that bag is one of the body parts. Now, not unreasonably, because the body parts were found in Morphed, which is the middle area here, and the line between Scotland and England occurs here, we know now that he had driven north to dump the bodies here. But if your police are finding bodies in Morphed, they're going to assume that this needs to be a Scottish case. And so as they started to find body parts, they talked to the experts in Edinburgh and in Glasgow. In Edinburgh, they talked to the celebrated pathologist Sidney Smith and the anatomist James Brash, and in Glasgow to the celebrated pathologist John Glaister. At no point that we're aware of prior to this case was anatomy, and therefore forensic anthropology by its extension, involved in an investigation in the UK. It was probably the first time. Now, they had found a significant number of body parts, and what they were going to have to do was try to piece them together. Now, the slides I'm going to show you next are photographs from the time, and the fact that these were taken are really quite exceptional, but they are quite disturbing as well. So of the 70 body parts that they found, what the anatomist and the pathologist started to do was to replace them piece by piece. This is what anatomists can do. The right arm belongs to the left arm. The right leg belongs to the left leg. If you've got 4 legs, you've got more than one person. And so they were able to place these body parts together. The one that you can see that's most intact here will become Isabella, and the one that is least intact here is Mary, because her torso was never found. Now, originally, because the pathologists were not anatomically trained and were not anthropologists, the police informed that what they had was a man and a woman. And so when the police information went out, they were saying, is there a missing couple? And there were no missing couples. So really the whole process went very, very cold. Wrapped around some of the body parts, though, were some newspapers. And the police, through drying them out very slowly, realized that they had been produced in a part of Morecambe that really said that maybe we need to be looking south of the border. And so the police from Scotland came down to Lancaster. And in Lancaster, they said, look, we've got a body of a man and a woman, and we found some newspapers from your area. Might they have been somebody from around here? And the police had said, well, no, we don't have a man and a woman missing. We have 2 missing women. And one of the women, her husband was a surgeon. Now that really got the police interest, because they said that the way in which the body had been dismembered, and you can see it here on Mary's hips in particular, this was, most dismemberments are a saw, and you saw through the bones. This had been disarticulated at the joints, at the hip joints, and you can see disarticulated at the shoulder joints. And so the pathologists were saying this was someone with expertise. When they went back, the pathologists, heaven bless them, said maybe we were wrong, maybe they are both women after all. And that was a really important turning point, because what we now had through the anatomist's work was an identification of two individuals who were probably female, that were of an age that matched with both Isabella and Mary. And the areas of dismemberment were removing areas where the women might have been identified. So Mary, for example, had a mole on her thigh, and that particular area of skin had been removed. Isabella was said to have thick ankles, and so all of the tissue around her ankles had been removed. And when it came to fingerprints, and I do apologize because this again is a challenging image, in Isabella, we could see that the fingers had been snipped off. And this was to ensure that fingerprints could not be taken. So for Isabella, we were not able to match fingerprints, but the same was not done for Mary. And so for Mary, we could take her fingerprints, and these were dermal fingerprints, the first time ever that a forensic scientist had compared dermal with epidermal fingerprints, something we would do quite regularly now. Mary was a housekeeper. They could go around the house wherever she touched a mirror or she'd polished the glass. They could recover her fingerprints and they could match Mary's fingerprints. So they were quite content that they could identify Mary. How were they going to be able to identify Isabella? And what they then did was something that again has become almost normal now, but was the first time it was ever done, and it was done in this case, which was they took a photograph of Isabella. They then took a photograph and an X-ray of her skull, and they were going to superimpose them. What they then did, and I'll show you that in a moment, is they went back to the house in Dalton Square and they dismantled the bathroom and they transferred the entirety of the contents of the bathroom, and here is the bath, arriving at Glasgow University. So rather than scientists going to the crime scene, they took the entire crime scene to the scientists. And again, that had never been done before. And that photograph I was talking to you about, this was what was achieved. A superimposition of photograph onto skull to show that the two matched. Now, this was such an iconic image that what the lawyers wanted to do was to get this image into court. But of course, this kind of information had never been used in court before. And so the judge had to decide if he would allow it to be admissible, which he chose to do. And as a result, what we ended up with a situation where Buck Ruxton always denied his responsibility. He always said he was innocent. But we had a situation in a courtroom for the first time that anatomists were coming in to give evidence in the courtroom about the identification of these two individuals. For whatever reasons, and courts have their reason, they decided not to prosecute him on Mary's death. They decided to prosecute him on Isabella's. And he was found guilty. And this gives you some idea of the level of intensity that the public have around court cases. So the one on the left are the ladies queuing outside the courtroom, sitting there on the sidewalk, having their breakfast before they go into the courtroom, because it was such a spectacle. And don't they look resplendent in their fur collars with their hats? When he was found guilty, they knew that they couldn't hold the court, in Lancaster, because he wouldn't get a fair trial. It was held in Manchester. And when he was found guilty, the picture that you see on the right are the queues outside Strangeways prison on the date on which he was being hanged. Now, they were never going to see anything, but they just accumulated. And there is part of the problem in the forensic world, is that there is an insatiable appetite for forensic matters that the public become really interested in. And trust me, with what we're seeing going on in the news, it will become now the same sort of spectacle. It happened then, it happened now. If you want to read about the Buck Ruxton case, this is a fantastic book written by Tom Wood, who's an ex-police officer, and it is the most marvelous account of the book, of the case, and I would advise it for you. But the other thing that tends to happen is that when you have something in a case that becomes so iconic like this, you tend to get those individuals who want to keep little mementos. And we had a situation where the bath in which the ladies were dismembered was retained by Manchester police. And they used it really inappropriately as a horse trough. So the horse would drink from the bath, and this was the plaque that you in front of you that they had on the wall next to the bath. This bath was used by Dr. Buck Ruxton when mutilating the bodies of his wife and his maid on an unknown date between the 14th and 29th of September 1935 at 2 Dalton Square, Lancaster. These cases don't ever disappear. They become really high profile. But what happened beyond there after the Buck Ruxton case was you get isolated cases where anatomists or archaeologists or anthropologists are being asked to look at a case. And what they're creating is a backlog. They're creating a body of work, if you excuse the pun, but they're doing it with isolated cases. And as a result, there is no discipline to forensic anthropology. There is just those who have expertise in osteoarchaeology or anthropology or anatomy helping the police on an ad hoc basis. That's never going to get you to a discipline where you are recognized for the rigor of your processes and your procedures. I'm going to take just a slight sidestep because there's something else going on beyond the sort of domestic situation of a one-by-one case. And what is happening at an international level. So we all hear about the Geneva Conventions, and the Geneva Conventions were primarily about rules that apply during armed conflict, during war, and it's about ensuring that rights are given to those who are sick and wounded of armed forces. And that start of an international approach towards what is right and proper for individuals is going to become important in due course. And so we know of the Geneva Conventions of their time and their appropriateness for them. But what they did was they also set up a route that took us towards the United Nations War Crimes Commission. And that happened after the Second World War. And of course, we know about the international military tribunals, which were of course the Nuremberg trials, because they were looking at war crimes associated particularly with the German situation. And it's the first time in international law we hear the term of prosecution for genocide being used. And it's a natural follow-on from the Geneva Conventions. Then we start to see international criminal tribunals coming forward, whether for the former Yugoslavia in 1993, for Rwanda in 1995, and that was the first time that we delivered verdicts on genocide, or in Cambodia, 1997 in the Khmer Rouge. There were other international criminal tribunals, but what we were starting to see was individuals who were being asked, can you look at these remains, identify these individuals, provide evidence to these criminal tribunals that we are looking at genocide, that we are looking at deaths. And each of these in turn led to the instigation of the International Criminal Court in 2002. Why did we start to see these international criminal tribunals coming forward? Because we were starting to see atrocities. Whether it was in relation to the Bosnian war crimes in the 1990s, where we had over 3,000 mass graves, and we're only estimating at the number of individuals who lost their lives. But the questions we're being asked of the lawyers is, when we find these mass graves, how can we identify who that individual was? We need to be able to show that these were non-combatants, that these were children and elderly, that they were women. What was the way in which they lost their life? Were they shot through the head, for example? Were they bludgeoned, whatever it may have been? And you can see how on a mass scale, we're now taking the expertise that a lot of people had gained in those one-by-one cases, and we were bringing them to mass numbers, whether that was in Bosnia, whether it was in Rwanda, and about 500,000 people who lost their death, went to their death in 100 days in Rwanda, whether we're talking about Cambodia, about 1.3 million people, or whether we're talking about Kosovo. So in that time, in the 1990s, we're starting to see the world looking at these war crimes investigations And we're looking at experts in anatomy and anthropology coming in to be a part of those teams. And in Kosovo in particular, because that's where my expertise lies, the British forensic team was the first forensic team to enter into Kosovo, because Louise Arbour, who was the chief prosecutor, had said, we need forensic teams to come in. Can your countries provide these gratis teams? And we moved in May and June of 1999. What we were looking at were scenes like this, where individuals had been herded into an outhouse. They had been shot, the premises had been burnt, the roof had collapsed on top of the bodies, and the roaming packs of dogs had used them as a food source. This was forensic anthropology, literally in the field. And it was a really challenging time, because the expectation was that your level of expertise and forensic relevance, irrespective of the conditions in which you were working, would still be of probative value when you have to give evidence in the international criminal courts against these individuals and others. So that knowing that as an expert witness, your end goal is always the courtroom, there is a real worry that sometimes a chasm can develop between those who find the subject really sexy, wouldn't that be fun to do, and the reality of it when you end up either in an international criminal court or in a court within your own country, where you are giving expert evidence that may result in somebody's death or may result in somebody's incarceration for the rest of their life. It can't be left to chance and those who just have an interest in a subject. And, you know, we started to see these disasters unfolding around the world, where that identification of the human became incredibly important. 2001, 2005, although the tsunami was Boxing Day 2004, the work that we were doing was right the way throughout 2005. The London bombing, Sharm el-Sheikh, Pakistan earthquake, Hurricane Katrina. Never before had anatomists and forensic anthropologists around the world found that their services were in such demand, because we had so many instances where, as a subject, we'd proved our worth and our capability, but we were now involved very much on the stage. But then things like this happen, because the public get really excited about sexy forensic things. And you start to get these kinds of television programs. 2000 was when CSI came out. And what you end up with is a public who are absolutely driven by, you know, the next episode and the next story, and we understand it, but it raises an expectation that we just can't meet. So the public think that they become forensically aware by watching these kinds of programs. They're about as far removed from reality as you can get, but there's almost a fest. And that fest is also infecting young people who are going through school thinking about, what do I want to do when I grow up? Oh, wouldn't it be fantastic to be a forensic something or another? And suddenly you're meeting a demand. You've got people clamoring to say, how do I get into the discipline? And if you thought CSI was bad, this one is even worse. It's about as far removed from reality as you can get. Anyone out there who's an anthropologist and anatomist knows the human skeleton never does that, quite frankly. But it's about entertainment. But the public doesn't always understand the distinct line between what is entertainment and what is real. And there was a clamor for these films, these television programs, these books. And as a result, there was a clamor for students who wanted to go to university and study forensic things. So in 2008, I had a look at what was happening in undergraduate programs in the UK, because we had 478 undergraduate programs that contained the word forensic. Now, some of them, architectural design and forensic studies, it's a bit of a challenge. How about dance and movement studies with forensic studies? How about astronomy and forensic science, European film and forensic science and tourism, and my absolute favorite, forensic investigation and early Christian doctrine. What that told you was that universities had recognized there was a demand. There were people who were really captivated by this forensic stuff, and they put on courses. And they were tagging on the word forensic to many things, and inappropriately to many things. And what was happening was that young people were being drawn into that because it sounded much more interesting if you put a bit of forensic in it. And of course, the result of it was that many individuals did not and were not able to get jobs. At the same time, we were trying to consolidate what the discipline was doing. We had, for a very brief period of less than a decade, the Council for the Registration of Forensic Practitioners. We were trying to bring some rigour to the discipline because we could see what was happening in some universities, not all by any means, and we could see the clamour for young people who wanted to get into the forensic world. The Council for the Registration of Forensic Practitioners failed, and in 2008, we had a forensic science regulator. The regulator still doesn't have statutory powers, but hopefully with a bill going through Parliament at the moment, they will very soon. And that became important because for the first time in the UK, in 2008, we had regulation coming into the world of forensic science. Where do the anthropologists go? Well, we had an organisation which is still going called the British Association for Human Identification, and that became a magnet for those individuals who not only were working in the anatomy field and the forensic anthropology field, but also had had that experiences overseas, whether from Bosnia or from Kosovo or wherever it may have been. It brought them together into one place. And in 2010, allowed the development of the British Association for Forensic Anthropology. 2010, we're only talking about 11 years ago. You know, this is not something back in the mists of time. It's taken up to this point for us to be able to have an association. And then we had a big hoo-ha in the UK because we closed the Forensic Science Service. And much of forensic science provision, certainly in England and Wales, went into the commercial companies. Scotland and Northern Ireland kept their forensic science laboratories. But it meant that there was now a different place that people were going to have to go if they wanted to practice their discipline. And that was the point at which we found the RAI, or the RAI found us, that said, we are an association, an institute that focuses on anthropology. Why can't forensic anthropology belong to the RAI? 2013. And that was a real turning point for the robustness of our discipline in the UK. Now, overseas, the Americans, the first Americans to be certified in forensic anthropology were back in 1977. So they were way ahead of the game. In Europe, the Forensic Anthropology Society of Europe, they first started to certify in 2012. And our first certifications coming through the RAI was in 2014. The first time that we had a process by which we could determine whether those individuals who were practicing this discipline in the UK had the credibility to practice.
Yeah,
we didn't have that before that point. And of course, as you can see, that the need for forensic anthropology is not something that is ever going to go away. And whatever the disaster is, whether it relates to multiple fatalities in situations such as this, or in air traffic disasters, or it happens as a result of terrorism, we know for a fact that the requirements of our disciplines are not going to go away. So what do UCAS look like in 2021? What do those disciplines now look like? I'm delighted to say that most of those very spurious ones have all gone. They've all disappeared because everybody realized what a waste of time. It's not going to get you a job. The number of undergraduate courses has still gone up, so it's not declined, but the subjects that we're seeing are forensic science, forensic computing, forensic psychology, cybersecurity, criminology. Reasonable disciplines where you can see these are subjects where there is a logic in the training. And if you look at forensic anthropology is offered in 6 universities in the UK. 4 of them at an undergraduate level and 5 of them at a postgraduate level. That's the only places where there are full degrees in forensic anthropology or a related discipline. There are others in osteoarchaeology, and I haven't included those. But what I find really disappointing is when you go onto the UCAS forum and you search for what jobs can I find for forensic anthropologists, the answer is none. That's really important. If we need the discipline and we're going to train people to do it, there have to be jobs for them to take up with that level of expertise. And that's what most of our graduates find really difficult. In a previous life, I made sure that when we were training our undergraduate forensic anthropologists, they became anatomists first of all. There is a global shortage of gross anatomy teachers. And I always felt if I can make you an anatomy teacher, then you can take your forensic anthropology skills with you. Better to have more than one string to your bow. So we do have in the UK a channel now through which students can come. We can train them how to be prepared for the forensic anthropology world, and we can get them out into the workplace, and we can mentor them so that they will become competent practitioners. The Forensic Science Regulator, and this is the copy coming from 2021, have codes of practice and conduct, and the regulator quite reasonably identified that you couldn't provide a code of practice for all the disciplines. Sometimes it was important for a discipline to be responsible for its own code of practice, but every forensic scientist has to be answerable to the code of conduct from the regulator. And you'll see for anthropology that what we have is a separate code of practice that is applicable and has been applicable since 2018. And that code of practice was set jointly between the Royal Anthropological Institute and the Forensic Science Regulator. That says in our discipline now, and we advise that anybody who is in the forensic anthropology field needs to be a fellow of the RAI, whether at a student level, a student fellow, or whether at a professional level. Because by being within this process, then we can guide you through the code of practice and the code of conduct as approved by the Forensic Science Regulator. So we have 3 levels of certification, and never more proud for the Royal Anthropological Institute that our charter was granted to the Institute this year. Although it's always been a Royal Anthropological Institute, the charter was only formally bestowed this year. And so our top level forensic anthropologists are now chartered forensic anthropologists. That status has increased. And these are our FA1s. They're the highest level of certification. They're really experienced practitioners, but you still have to go through an examination. And I've done it. It's the most terrifying thing when you've been an expert in a field for 30 years and you still have to go through and examine it. And that fear that you're probably going to fail doesn't go away. And so you submit your casework and it's assessed by your peers and an external examiner. And then horror of horrors, you have a viva examination. And I can remember being examined by a formidable lawyer who asked me about a particular document. And I can remember saying to her, I couldn't tell you when it was published. If it helps, I know it's got a purple cover. That's probably not the kind of thing that they were looking for in the viva, but I'm relieved to say that I actually did pass. But our chartered forensic anthropologists, once you're there, you still have to recertify every 5 years to show that you're remaining current. Our FA2s, this is a level of practitioners, and they evidence their competence both in theoretical and practical knowledge by examination. And that again is terrifying. We know it is, but you need to go through that examination process so that there is a confidence in your theoretical and your practical knowledge. We accept that they might not have given evidence in a courtroom by this point, but they will be mentored by an FA1. So what we have is a really close mentoring system that allows our FA2s to get the experience to themselves become FA1s. And then our largest category are FA3s, and often they tend to be postgraduate students who have an undergraduate degree that's applicable. They may be studying in forensic anthropology. They may be doing a little bit of work of identifying whether remains are human or not. And often for much of that, they're about animal remains. But these FA3s are also mentored. They're mentored by FA2s and by FA1s. So what we have is a pipeline of experienced practitioners looking after and guiding those who have less experience. And this is the rigour that the RAI gave to our discipline in really less than a decade ago. What we're now looking at doing is certifying the courses. If universities choose to go down that route, they can look at the curriculum that we believe as the RAI is appropriate for somebody who's going to become a forensic anthropologist. And if the curriculum that the university is teaching maps onto what we think our anthropologists need to know, then that university will be able to become a certified course. So it shows how the RAI, working with the forensic science regulator, working with those who are moving their subject forward, don't necessarily know what path they're taking. And it's a slightly circuitous route, but we do get there. And here's the final point, and I'm just about on time, which is a huge relief, is that the two academies within the UK, so the Royal Society and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, have developed something that are called judicial primers. And these primers are pieces of prose, very, very pithy pieces of prose, on a particular subject that are written in such a way, and I don't mean this in a disparaging note at all, because this is the language used by the judges themselves, that the science is in a written format that judges can understand. And I'm delighted to say that ongoing at the moment is a forensic anthropology primer. And those primers, two of the writing team are members of the Royal Anthropological Institute Forensic Anthropology Committee. So right at the heart, the RAI is right at the heart of not only bringing our discipline forward through its processes and its procedures into the forensic regulator, which is the Home Office, and now into the courts at a level at which our judges and our juries can have confidence in the science that we portray. It started back with the Buck Ruxton case in the 1950s with an anatomist and some pathologists. And we've had a moderately circuitous route that has taken us to the point where we are about to publish a judicial primer. And that primer goes out to every single court in the UK, so that every judge in the UK will know what forensic anthropology is about and how far experts can go with the science or they can't. We know that it's also being picked up by our Commonwealth countries, particularly in Australia and in Canada. And we're starting to get a lot of traction with the American courts who are saying we really like how simple these booklets are, because the documents that they have going into the American courts are literally just almost, they're almost impenetrable. When we get to the point that we're about to publish the forensic anthropology primer, if I tell you that most papers, when you publish them, go through maybe 3 or 4, if you're lucky, reviewers, every single primer goes through 40 reviewers. 20 of them are judges, 10 of them are world-leading scientists, and 10 of them are forensic practitioners. And only then, when signed off by those 40 reviewers, will the Royal Society and the Royal Society of Edinburgh put their stamp on it. And because of the involvement of the RAI, this primer will come back to our council as well for their approval before it's published. And that shows you, I think, just how core and central the RAI has become to the discipline of forensic anthropology in the UK. I'm going to stop at that point with a 5-minute breather, hopefully, and I think I've almost got us back on time. Emma, can I hand that back over to you?
Thank you so much, Sue. That was completely fascinating on so many levels. And I really look forward to discussing. So let's take a 5-minute break. And when we come back, please be ready with your questions. If you'd like to put them yourself, then use the hand function in the reactions at the bottom of the box of your window. Otherwise, put your questions in the chat. It is really useful if you put question, but I will take anything that you put in the chat and put it to Sue in a few minutes. So let's take a 5-minute break and we'll be back. Thanks so much. I think that was about 5 minutes. Are you ready, Sue?
I am. The sun's come round and it's suddenly got very hot up here in my attic. So apologise that I'm a little bit warm, which is lovely.
I'm envious. Love it. I'm going to start with a general question, if I may. And we've got a load of questions in the chat as well, and some of them are quite specific. But I'm really interested in forensic anthropology as work, and I'm interested in understanding more about the skill that's involved. And I'm thinking about three particular kinds of skills that you've touched on. So one is, did you already have, or did you have to develop, I suppose, what we think of as a kind of stomach for this kind of work? It's funny that we locate it in the stomach, but it looks extremely tough on many levels, including a kind of an emotional level. So how do you develop the stomach?
I think it's different for everybody.
Yeah.
Is the honest truth, and I think everybody finds their own way through it. For some, they have an expectation of what it may be like, and it isn't, and they just don't want to do it, and you shouldn't. I think I was very lucky in that I think I had a considerable amount of desensitization before I got there. What I mean by that is my father was a tremendous shot, and I used to go out with my father, any excuse to go out with my father if he was shooting, and he would shoot rabbits and deer and pigeons and, you know, those sorts of things, always for the pot. And I would go out with my father and I'd help him carry back the rabbits or whatever. And my mother was squeamish, and so I would sit at the back door with my father and skin rabbits and pluck pigeons. And so for me, you know, being around corpses, even though of animals, that was from about the age of 7 or 8. So very, very young. When I was 12, my job every Saturday and every holiday was in a butcher shop. And so again, I was very comfortable in dealing with bone and muscle and viscera, whether it be liver or heart, you know, you name it. When I got to university, then it seemed a very logical step to move into an anatomy department, because it was dissection of an animal form, but a different animal. And there is that Rubicon that you have to pass the first time you cut into human skin. It is different. But I think I had an element of desensitization to there. And because I'd been in anatomy, then it was an easier step into the mortuary. And then having worked in the mortuary for a number of years on single cases, to then be able to cope with the mass fatality events that we saw in things like Kosovo. So I think I had a very easy sort of almost desensitizing process, which not everybody has.
When you're doing the kind of incredibly difficult work that you did in Kosovo, do you get the kind of support or supervision or whatever that you might get if you're, for example, within the NHS dealing with a lot of turbulence, but in this case also dealing with your own reactions to what must be very, very difficult work?
No, absolutely none. Absolutely no support whatsoever. Towards the end of Kosovo, the Metropolitan Police, on our very last mission, and we'd been in country for 2 years by that point, decided that they would send out 2 counsellors, I suppose. And they came into a team that had been working solidly together for 8 to 10 weeks. And we took exception to these strangers who came into our team and to ask us how we felt. We didn't want to tell them how we felt, because we used the team for our counselling. We talked to each other, and I found that all of the support we needed were in those who understood what you were doing. And I know it isn't that way anymore, but at that time, it was expected that if you went into the forensic field, then you'd cope with it and you'd be fine. And some people weren't, is the honest truth. They really weren't.
That's completely fascinating. I've done research with very traumatized young women who refused to talk to counsellors. They said there's only, this is in Sierra Leone, It's only other young women who've experienced the same thing that
can understand. And you know, some of those people that I spent a long time with, you would never choose to spend time with some of these people. You really wouldn't. But because they're a part of your team, they become really close-knit to you. And even if you haven't seen them for 20 years, when you do see them, you can slip into that mode because they're the only people who really knew what was happening at that time. And that sort of buddying camaraderie that you see quite a lot in forces really is what holds a team together. If that falls apart, then a team becomes quite ineffective very swiftly.
That's completely fascinating. I'm really interested in some of the other skills, but I'm hoping people will ask about them, and I want to give other people a chance to quiz you. So I've got a question from Deborah James, which I'll put, Deborah, unless you put your hand up, which goes like this. It's about the field of forensic anthropology. Was the move towards regulation, I can see you've unmuted, would you like to?
No, it's all right, you go for it.
Was the move towards regulation done not only to monitor the proliferation of dodgy university courses, but also to monitor the people claiming to be experts in the field? Were there examples of people claiming expertise who got hired to do work that turned out to be less than professional? Very different.
Yes. So it is both of those. It was about ensuring that what we had was a robust pathway through the universities. I was delighted to see that many of those spurious courses really did just fall away because, you know, people are not silly, they really aren't. And you really saw a consolidation of forensic courses coming in behind that first wave. You almost had to let that first wave crash on the beach that was just nonsense for the real science to come in. But what we also had was a situation where people were coming out of courses saying, well, I've got a degree in forensic something or another. And the police would say, well, that's fine. You know, we'll take you and you can do this course, this case with us. Now that person may never ever have been on a case in their life, but because they had a university degree that said they'd studied it, and often to get the experience, what they would say to the police is, I'll do this at no cost for you. And as a result, you had people coming forward into cases who didn't have the experience, who didn't have the sort of robustness behind them of knowing, A, how to deal with the police, because that's a challenge in itself, but also knowing and understanding what was required in a full forensic report, what disclosure meant, what it meant to keep the case notes that you're required to do, and then what the court is going to expect of you when you get there. So we had a number of so-called practitioners in that time who fell away. And it was interesting to note who came forward for the certification process and who didn't. And there are a number of reasons why people did. Some felt that I can't go forward because I don't want to be anything other than an FA1, but they didn't have the expertise, and they didn't want to come in at FA2 because they thought that that wasn't a sufficiently high standing. And really, if they'd had, you know, the humility to say, come into the process and we'll help you get to where you need to be, then they could have come on board. Some chose just not to go through that process because they didn't want to go through it. It wasn't what they were about. And there will be a variety of other reasons. But it got to a point where we needed to have a process, and we needed to be able to have the police and the courts aware that there was a robust process approved by the regulator. And the first thing you should be asking anyone who thinks they have the anthropological expertise is, are you RAI certified? And that was a real sort of leafleting nightmare to get all that information out to the police and the courts, but they have it now. And one of the first things you get asked in court is, are you RAI certified? At what level? Who is your mentor? And it shows that the court gets it, because the court only wants to bring in experts that are going to help the jury understand. And often in the earlier stages, the expertise they were getting left them vulnerable and exposed.
Fascinating.
So thank you, Deborah. That's a really good question.
I don't want to lose sight of the police. You talked about sort of, I don't know if you quite put it like this, but establishing credibility with the police. So how do you have to be? How do you have to communicate with them? How do you have to deal with them? What are they impressed by and what are they unimpressed by?
They are equally impressed and unimpressed by qualifications, if you know what I mean. So they quite like to be able to say, well, you know, we've got a professor and they've got this, this, and this after their name. But then they also get, oh, you know, everybody's a professor. So you kind of get that little bit of, you know, they like the qualifications, but they're also a little bit, you know, we don't need the qualifications type thing. But it takes a long time to build relationships with police. Now, it's very different in England and Wales than it is in Scotland and Northern Ireland. So in England and Wales, all of the forensic anthropology operates through commercial providers. So they employ forensic anthropologists. And each of the police forces, through a tendering process, works with one commercial provider. So that they know, the police know in a particular force, if they require a forensic anthropologist, their provider will go find one for them. In Scotland, the forces get to know you and they get to know who to go to, and the same in Northern Ireland. So there's much more of a personal connection in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and it's more on a commercial footing in England and Wales.
Ah, fascinating. Okay, we've got a question here from S. Connor. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. I'm curious what your thoughts are on research of cognitive bias in forensic anthropology. This topic has been researched in other fields within forensic science, such as DNA, fingerprinting, etc. However, there seems to be a slower uptake of this subject within forensic anthropology research. Where do you see this research in terms of improving the work done in our field?
So I think we do have to be aware of cognitive bias. We absolutely do. And we try to mitigate against it as best we can. And, you know, for example, when you go on a police case, we try to say to them, please don't tell us who you think it is. Don't tell me you're looking for a 25-year-old woman, because when I look at the remains, I'll be asking, is the individual 25? Is it a woman? Whereas I need to be asking, what age is this individual and what sex is this individual? So we try to persuade the police not to give us extraneous information that will bias us in our opinion. Some of the research that's been done in cognitive bias in forensic anthropology, certainly the last time I looked, and it might not be the most recent, I think had some fundamental flaws within it. So I think there's a long way to go, but there is no discipline that at the end of the day cannot pay attention to cognitive bias. We must, because we have to be aware of it. It's one of the scientists' biggest enemies, is the assumption that I've got this, it looks like this, therefore it must be this. That at the end of the day, when you're trying to be an unbiased scientist, an objective scientist, and when you go into the courtroom, you are not an expert witness for the prosecution or for the defense. You're an expert witness for the court, and your evidence should be the same, irrespective of whether it was the prosecution or the defense that retained you. And so knowing how unbiased you have to be, in some ways, I think we're probably better than many disciplines and possibly worse than others. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done.
What's a poor way to present the evidence when you're in court? Is court a different arena from other arenas? Oh,
very. I mean, it is a stage. It is a performance. I was doing a podcast with somebody this morning on justice, and they were looking at it from the perspective of the accused. So, you know, you go in, and if you're an expert witness, you're put in a box. So first of all, you're contained in a box, and you're in a room that is alien, and you have somebody on one side of you in funny wig and robes, speaking words that you don't necessarily understand. And you've got another group of individuals in front of you in black robes and funny wigs. And one side will view you as being their expert, because we're not their expert. They will view you as being their expert. And the other side, their job is to be able to identify where your flaws are, because we have an adversarial legal system. And it's a very gladiatorial, combinatorial environment, and an environment in which scientists are generally very uncomfortable. And so you have to develop this poker face that doesn't allow you to get riled. Because bearing in mind, you know, if you're the Crown witness, for example, the first part of the examination will be by the Crown, and everything will go terribly smoothly. The second part of the examination will be from the defence, and they will come at you in a gladiatorial form. Now, you may have been standing for the last 6 hours. In Scotland, you have to stand. And so you're exhausted by the end of the day. And you have to know that you cannot stray beyond the limits of your own expertise, and you cannot let them use tactics that get underneath your skin. And when I go into the courtroom, I have a routine that I look at the jury, and I look at the lawyers, and I look at the judge. I never ever look at the accused, and I never ever look at the public gallery or the family, because if you can shut out extraneous information, it allows you to focus on your job. And your job is to explain your evidence to the jury, because the jury are the triers of fact. They are the most important people in the courtroom. And if they don't understand your evidence, you've been a very poor witness. So you have to get your science across in understandable, simple language. They may think they're forensically aware because they watch CSI. The honest truth is they probably aren't.
Did you find that you were good at it from the get-go?
Oh, no.
You had to learn, and do you mentor other people?
Yeah, you have to get blooded, and there is no doubting you have to get blooded by it, and no one can prepare you, because sometimes court cases that you think will be difficult are just, they're over in no time at all because of the strategy that the legal teams have adopted, and you're not aware of the strategy. It's like being a player in a game, but nobody has told you what the rules are. And so, you are front and center in that game, but you don't actually know because you're not told what it is that's going on around you. And that's very, very disconcerting. And you learn over time what the tricks are. But, if you've had teenage children, it doesn't matter if you tell somebody and you try to give them the benefit of your wisdom. The only way you learn it is when it happens to yourself.
Yeah, anthropology teaches you the importance of practice in learning processes.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to rattle through, because you have a lot of questions. I'm going to rattle through quite a few. So we've got to this historical question. What might have given them the idea of trying dermal fingerprints on the first occasion?
So anatomists were aware, because of the work that had been done on histology, that there were two sets of fingerprints. The epidermal fingerprints, which are the ones that you can see, and then when that top layer of skin comes off, that there is a print underneath. Now, they don't exactly match, but they're quite close. And because Mary's body had been in the water, you get something called washerwoman's hands, which means that the top layer of skin comes off. So the anatomist would have known that the epidermal print had gone, but he was able to take the dermal print and then compare it to Mary's epidermal prints that she had left all around the house. So it was the first time that that was used. It was the first time that I think entomology in the UK was used to try to determine a time since death, and certainly the first time that superimposition was used. So a tremendous number of firsts in forensic science in that case. And as I say, the book by Tom is just beautifully written. If anybody wants to read it, it really is a fascinating read.
Why did they take the bathroom to the university rather than the experts to the bathroom?
I think at that point, you're talking about experts in the field who had a reputation. So if you remember when Bernard Spilsbury would come into court as the pathologist, he had such a persona that the lawyers used to say, if we can get Bernard in, guy's going to be guilty. And I think the pathologists in particular had such a persona that if they wanted the entirety of the bathroom transferred up to Glasgow, they got it. And that's what they did. So it came from the pathologist that they wanted everything moved up to Glasgow.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Okay, we're going back to more about forensic anthropology. Could we have a definition of forensic and then of forensic anthropology?
Oh, there are lots of them. And most of them don't actually encapsulate the entirety of the discipline. So it's a fundamentally flawed term. The forensic bit is Latin, and it means pertaining to the forum, forensis, and the forum of the courts of Rome. So anything forensic means pertaining to a court. The anthropology is Greek, the study of man or the human. So really the definition is the study of the human for the purposes of the court. Now, that doesn't define what we think forensic anthropology really is. For many individuals, it's about identification of bone, but for others, it's much more than that. It's using a lot of soft tissue as well. So it's a kind of thing that whichever definition you come out with, somebody will object to it somewhere.
Right. Okay. Now we've got some more questions about forensic anthropology related to other disciplines. So Rebecca's studying, she's doing an MRes in forensic anthropology and bioarchaeology in Wales. Is that not counted because it includes bioarchaeology?
So at the point at which I was looking through UCAS, I was looking for those degrees that were very firmly focused on forensic anthropology as a subject. Some of the universities are partitioning forensic anthropology with another discipline, which is a good idea because the chances of you getting a job in forensic anthropology are slim. And so if you can have skills in another field, and if that's in the bioarch, then, you know, that's a really good thing to link it to. All I would check is that if you wanted to go into the forensic anthropology field, that the entire range of the subject that the RAI says this is what you need to cover if you're going to go into this field, to make sure that that is covered. I can't comment on the individual program because I don't know about its content, but there is a real logic to having a little bit of one and a little bit of the other, simply if you're looking at future employment opportunities.
Yeah, which sounds challenging. Okay, Sophia asks, do you ever see paleontologists moving into forensic anthropology? Sophia is a mammal paleontologist, wondering if her skills and experience are forensically valuable, and if perhaps there's a space instead in forensic investigations relating to the mistreatment of animals.
So we do, certainly at the investigative stage, have an involvement in identifying animal species. So, for example, if you look at the World Trade Center, those individuals who are on the triage, looking at all of the fragments passing through, World Trade Center had restaurants. Those restaurants would have pig and cow and sheep and chicken. So you'll have animal remains alongside human remains. So on a triage, for example, being able to pick out what is human and what is not human is really important, because a tremendous waste of resource if you send a huge amount of animal material away for DNA analysis, for example, because there will be nothing to match it with when we're looking to identify individuals. So really useful for triage in particular. And, you know, we ran an identification service for all the police forces in the UK, and we would have, you know, several hundred cases come into us every year. 99% of them that came into us were animal. And these would be people digging in their back garden, putting in their primulas that come across a bone. And they'd phone the police because people seem to want to find dead bodies in their garden. I've never understood why. They get very excited about it. And the police would take a photograph and they'd send it up to us, and we'd go cow, sheep, pig. So being able to identify animal excludes further investigation. So it is really important.
Okay, so Sarah asks, would you like to talk more about what's involved in mentoring? And I'd also like to add, when will university certification be in place?
You'd have to, I'm going to take the second one first, and you would have to ask the Forensic Anthropology Committee of the RAI, because I'm not sure just how far advanced they've got in that certification process for courses. I know it's underway, but I don't think it's completed yet. So I think that's still ongoing. The mentoring is important, and all FA1s must mentor, because it's part of our requirement for certification that we mentor. So you can't reach a status and think, that's fine, I'm here, I'm not going to bother helping anybody else. That's not allowed. So everybody signs up that if you're going to be an FA2 or an FA1, then you need to take mentoring responsibility. And on the RAI website, you can see we have all the names of all the certified practitioners and who their mentor is. And sometimes mentoring will be about locality. So for example, it's somebody who lives in the same area as their mentor. So their mentor may be able to give them experience into cases. The individual that I mentor lives in Ireland, so I can't do that, but he does go out and he does cases. And when he writes up his report, my job is to go through his report with him to make sure that he's covered everything that he possibly could cover and to prepare him if he needs to go to court. I can't physically be there with him when he's doing a case. So there's a mixture of the different type of mentoring.
Okay, great. More questions about preparing for employment. So Natalie asks, if I have a master's degree in bioarchaeological and forensic anthropology at UCL, and I'm interested in pursuing forensic anthropology further, how do I go about getting these certification titles? And does archaeological fieldwork experience help in these considerations?
Yes, it does. So providing you've had experience of working with human bone, and you can evidence that you have, so you've done the courses that shows you've studied it, and maybe in your practical work you've looked at animal bone and human bone, that may be sufficient for you to enter in at the FA3 level. And so that's really important. It gets you on that first rung. And then it's about finding the right mentor in the right place for you to help you move forward. Now, it's not a straightforward process because, as we've said, there is not a lot of work in the field. So whether that's because we don't have a particularly high crime rate, we don't tend to have a lot of bodies lying around, is the honest truth, which is why we always say, if you're going to be a forensic anthropologist, if you can have another string to your bow, so much the better, whether it's as an academic, whether it's as an archaeologist, whether it's as an anatomist, whatever it may be, something else that will pay the bills fundamentally, but means that you have the expertise that you can be brought in. Often that's the most realistic outcome for most people. There are very few people employed full-time as a forensic anthropologist.
Member of the House of Lords, for example. Okay.
Yes, Mom.
Is it possible to get a certificate in the UK if my education has been done in Sweden?
Yes, it is, providing you can evidence that the kinds of things that you've been studying are what we're looking for. And so it's distinctly possible. There is no geographical constraint at an FA3 level. By the time you're getting to FA1, then yes, you have to have experience of working on cases within the UK because you are now entering into the judicial process. And so that preparation for being able to be an expert witness in the country means that you have to have that UK experience. But you can enter into the process with the sort of base level knowledge that will come with most degrees in the subject, regardless of where they're done around the world.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Another question about preparing for careers. I'm doing forensic anthropology as an undergraduate in Dundee, where I think you were, if I'm not wrong.
You're right.
Job prospects be better if I were to do an anatomy undergrad and then a master's in forensic anthropology?
So I'm biased, and I'm biased because I am a human anatomist. And I always said to all of my students in Dundee, if I can make you an anatomist first of all, then I can make you a forensic anthropologist. But what we had was an undergraduate, although the undergraduate was called, and I don't know if it's the same now, so I apologize if I'm slightly wrong, but what we set up was that the undergraduate degree was in forensic anthropology. Your first 2 years were general sort of science subjects. Your third year was the anatomy department and dissection. And in your fourth year, we taught you the forensic anthropology. So we gave you the skill set in anatomy to be able to inform you in the forensic anthropology. So either you can do an undergraduate degree in anatomy, or the Dundee course did have anatomy in, and full body dissection is where you want to be, did have full body dissection in the forensic anthropology undergraduate degree.
Brilliant. Hannah, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, yes.
Hello, Hannah.
Hi, Sue. Thank you for the interesting talk. So I've got a question. I'm currently studying a PhD looking at ways to differentiate human from animal bone. which has been compromised in some way. So far, I've only focused on burnt bone because it's my understanding that that's when it's most challenging if you've only got a tiny fragmented charred piece of remains. But I just would love to know your opinion on when it's most challenging to make that differentiation. I know you're an expert, and I've read your book, and I know I've listened to you identifying tiny little bits of finger bones as human, but I didn't know.
It's really hard. It's the honest truth. One of the most difficult things is the smaller the bit that you have, the more challenging it is to be certain of where it's come from. And it comes to a point, unless there is a very obvious feature, being able to tell if it's animal or human can be really difficult to do. So any technique that allows us to gain some certainty in being able to include that fragment as being human or exclude it as being animal is extremely important. And you know, the research that you're doing very, very much adds to that base, which is brilliant. Certainly in Scotland, we've got into a position where in most fatal fires in Scotland, they will take the anthropologist out to a fatal fire. And the reason for that is often where you have remains that are quite badly burnt, as you will know, they become very fragile. And often when the body's lifted, parts get left behind, often bits of fingers or sometimes bits of toes. And our job is to try and identify these tiny fragments. But if you've had 4 cats killed in the fire as well, you're trying to figure out whether the little bit of bone I've got belongs to the human or belongs to one of the cats. And much of the time, we might not be able to do that. But the kind of research that you're doing will allow us, hopefully, to be able to make that decision. So incredibly worthwhile. Keep at it.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, hopefully so.
Oh, I hope you're enjoying the PhD.
Yeah, I love it. I'm having a great time. Yes, thank you.
Good, I'm glad. Well, good luck.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Hannah.
I'm sort of beginning to understand that maybe we do have in common with forensic and social. I'm a social anthropologist, so I go in and I study politicians, trying to find out what's going on behind the scenes. And I suppose there is in common a sort of like a kind of detective work in a way, trying to sort of make connections and understand what isn't immediately apparent.
It's the investigation in us all. There's a little bit of Morse or Taggart or whatever sort of, you know, police officer you want in a detective inside us all, that there's a puzzle. And, you know, we've been given something and we've got to try and figure out what tools do I need to use in my head to make this piece of information in front of me give up its secrets. What can it tell me about the person? Is it a person? How long has it been dead? Is it a man or a woman? Is it a child? Is it an adult? You know, all of these sort of questions. You're constantly throwing questions. And isn't that what research is about? It's about saying, I've got a lot of questions. What am I going to use in tools to help me get to that answer? And that's why we become addicted to research, is that we're trying to get to an answer using the tools that we've got. And I think that's why it's in many ways compulsive, what we do. And it's easy to understand as well. The one thing about any aspect of forensic science is it's a fantastic tool for public engagement and public understanding. Because I can remember being in lectures in the sort of life sciences of my previous institution, where I didn't even understand the title of the presentation. I've never understood what ubiquitination is in relation to proteins, I think it was, or maybe kinases or something. I can't remember. But I can remember feeling really dense because I really didn't even understand what the title meant. Whereas when you take forensic science, people understand it. They understand that there is a puzzle, that there is a mystery, that you use science to help you understand it. And at the end of the day, the real goal is that you put the right people on the right side of the bars. You help justice do its job. And that's compelling. People understand that. So the public engagement side of forensic science is a huge strength. And when it comes to things like our research excellence framework, often there's very little funded research goes on in forensic science, I hate to tell you. But the impact that the research does is immense, just as Hannah was saying. So her research, if that then gets used in a case, that may be the decider in that case on whether the human was present or not, whether the person gets prosecuted or not, whether the jury finds them innocent or guilty. That bit of research can be utterly critical to somebody's life and their freedom. And that's a big, big challenge.
Yeah, absolutely, but extremely galvanizing. I've got a question here from an undergraduate who's thinking ahead and has an ambition of studying a master's and PhD in forensic anthropology. Is joining the RAI the ideal first step?
Of course it is. And if I didn't say that, everybody behind the scenes in the RAI would be throwing things at me.
Do you have any advice about what comes next? Would the RAI walk me through all stages? But also, is there anything I can do as an undergraduate to get experience that would be useful?
So we get asked quite a lot, and usually from young students who are leaving school, going to university, saying, how do I get experience? Not surprisingly, it's very difficult to get experience in a forensic case, because that forensic case is a murder. It's a dismemberment. It's something very serious. And the chances of police letting somebody come in to get work experience is extremely slim, to be perfectly honest. But what you can do is, you can go and work for a police force or for a scene of crime and help them out. Even if all you have to do is clean the shovels at the end of the day, at least you're still immersed in the subject. Go and help the courts out, so that there are internships and there are jobs that you can do within the court that is allowing you to understand what is happening in that courtroom. Or go along to your local archaeological society or your archaeology department and do some work in cleaning bones, for example. Anything that just gives you exposure to any part of the process, whether it's at the policing side, whether it's at the bone side, or whether it's at the court side, all of that will add. It might not feel as if it's got forensic relevance, but remember, the forensic thing just means in the court. There is no such thing as forensic science. There is only science. And it's when that science gets used in the courtroom, it becomes called forensic science. It's the same science. And it's the science that's important.
Brilliant. Jacqueline Davey, would you like to ask your question? Delighted to see another.
Thank you. Hi, Sue. And
hello,
thanks.
Jacqueline.
Great talk. It was in the presentation. It was amazing. In relation to what you just said, though, I was just wondering. I am a third-year undergrad doing biological anthropology, obviously hoping to go into forensic anthropology. But I've done quite a bit of experience with Mola. I don't know if you've heard of Mola in Northampton. So
oh yes.
Yeah, so I've done a bit of work experience with them and aim to get some more work experience through the police. I'm not too keen on doing my master's yet. I want a bit of a break. And I was just wondering, would you say that master's degrees are required for forensic anthropology?
Are they required? I think the world in which you're operating is very different to the world in which I operated, because I'm very, very much older than you are. I didn't have a degree in forensic anthropology, and I didn't do a master's. So my degree was in human anatomy, and I literally fell into it all the way along. So my route is not relevant, I don't think, to today's route. If you want to be a forensic anthropologist, the way to do that in England and Wales is to become employed by a commercial provider. That commercial provider, everybody will be applying for that post because they're so rare. So they will be looking, have you got a relevant undergraduate? Have you got a relevant postgraduate perhaps? Or have you done a PhD that makes the subject relevant? They're pitting you against everybody else who applies. And you need to get yourself into a position where you are comparable, if not better, than everybody else who will apply. And that's really challenging, because these jobs come up really like hen's teeth in that regard, which is why I always say you need to do something else as well as be a forensic anthropologist. In Scotland, at the moment, as far as I'm aware, the only forensic anthropologists Police Scotland use are coming out of Dundee. I'm not sure that they use forensic anthropologists from anywhere else. So if I was smart and in Scotland, I'd be in the right place at the right time in the hope that you would get the experience that would allow you to go up that ladder. So it is about knowing where you are in the world, where you want to be in the world, and what's the best mechanism to get you into that position. So for example, Lucina Hackman, Professor Hackman, is the senior forensic anthropologist in Scotland. She chairs the RAI committee on forensic anthropology. And when she goes out to a case, she will take the PhD students, for example, that are studying with her, and she will give them the experience. Now, what she'd love to do is retire and be able to hand it on to somebody else. And whether she's at that stage or not, I'm sure she'd smack me around the head if I told her I thought she was retiring. But it's about being in the right place at the right time.
Right, okay, thank you.
It's very challenging to get a job in the subject. It's such a fascinating subject.
Yeah.
But I would caution that if you want a real job, the chances of it being forensic anthropology are slim.
Yeah.
But you're much more likely to get an academic post, in which case you become a teacher and a researcher, but you can keep those skills. And then it's about looking for when the opportunity comes and seizing it.
That's great, thank you.
You're welcome.
So
I would advocate, the other thing I would say is I would advocate that you think about joining BAFA, which is the British Association for Forensic Anthropology, because there is a community there as well that would help you in terms of identifying the best routes forward.
I have had a look at that, so thank you. Yeah, I've looked into all that, thank you.
You're welcome.
Interest in the chat, it's really fascinating. Such an interest, so many people asking about a career in forensic anthropology.
And it's challenging because it's the kind of career that sounds so, you know, so enticing, but you have to be realistic about the chances of actually finding that job.
Yeah. So you've talked about this, but you may want to add to the question, which secondary career routes kind of are most complementary and would aid in casework and certification progression? And then another person's asked a sort of related question. Does the methods that are the same for forensic anthropology and the ones that we use on archaeological fields concerning bones, are
Okay.
used in archaeology similar to the ones in forensic anthropology? So
I got there, and you have to remind me what the first one was. I've got such a
really both. Well, one of them is about methods, same method. The other one is about what are the best complementary routes.
So I'm obviously going to say human anatomy because there is a world shortage of teachers in gross anatomy. And so, you know, I have seen some of my students literally go, we used to keep a map, we used to put pins on all the different places around the world that they'd gone. And so that was a tremendous skill if you were prepared to stay in the academic field. So an anatomy degree is a really useful degree, providing it's got full body dissection. And that's what a lot of the countries are looking for. That's really useful. The other that's really useful is archaeology. So that if you can have archaeological skills in terms of body recovery, whether it's, you know, clandestine graves, having archaeology alongside anthropology is incredibly useful as well. So those for me would probably be the top two. When it comes to methods, they are the same methods, but there are some that you will use and some that you will not. And the reason that you have to choose those is that the method you use, for whatever characteristic it might be, you have to bear in mind that it is going to be cross-examined in court. So the lawyers will ask you, where was it published? Is that a credible journal? What sort of a population was used to establish that methodology? Has it been tested on material that is of documented origin? Has it been tested on modern material or just archaeological? And you have to bear in mind that what they're looking to do is to undermine the methodology that you've used. So you have to choose very, very carefully in your reports the methods that you use. Whilst you might be content in an archaeological setup to have something that has perhaps been verified on archaeological material, if it's not been verified as a methodology on current and modern material, you're going to be on a sticky wicket once you get into court if the defense team or the prosecution team want to cross-examine you on your methodology. And there are three things that lawyers are taught. They're taught about your evidence, and they will come after your evidence that says, is it accepted by the scientific community? What was the basis of that research? What was that research carried out on? And it is trying to, in some ways, identify whether you really know what you're doing. If they can't come after you on evidence, they will come after you on your processes and procedures. So I have seen an expert in court be taken down because they didn't write on their notes how many hours they had spent at a microscope. If you're not an accurate note taker, how can we trust you as an expert? And then what they will do is they will come after you personally. So trust me, lawyers will troll Twitter and Facebook and Google, and they will find everything they possibly can about you. And if there's a photograph out there of you drunk on a Friday night at the side of the road, they will say, is this really an acceptable expert? So it's very, very challenging.
Oh my goodness. You have to have such a strange mixture of
You do.
skills, sort of probity, all sorts of things.
Yeah. You have to be prepared for anything that could come at you on the courtroom. So don't leave yourself exposed. Don't go out there and write outrageous things on Twitter or Facebook, because they will look. If you're going to be the expert in court, the first thing they will do is go onto Google and find out what they can find out about you.
That is fascinating. Somebody asked for advice for an aspiring.
Yeah, don't do Facebook and Twitter and Google and such things. Yeah.
Right.
Unless you're very careful.
Yeah. Okay, that is very interesting. So you have to, as the politicians say, think about how things might play in the.
Yes, you do. And if you've been in the business for a long time, that's a long back catalogue that you've got. And if there's anything in your past, you can bet every single legal team will go back to that point time after time after time, and you will never escape from it.
Sadly, we've only got about another 5 minutes for questions, and I still have more than 35 to ask you. But I will send them to you.
Thank you.
For your interest. But I want to give you the chance at the very end, just to make sure you've said everything you want to say, in case, you know, if there's.
Oh, I think I've said enough.
In that case, I'll just keep you asking. Here's an intriguing one. Have your feelings on taphonomic research facilities changed? Do you think they have any scientific backing, or are the lack of quantitative and repeatable testing methods too detrimental for the study?
So I can understand why the taphonomic facilities are set up. These are the equivalent of body farms. I hate that term, but that's what they mean, where bodies are laid out in different situations to decompose under different conditions, and research is done on these. And what they tend to do is they tend to tell you about what happens in that locality that is not necessarily transferable to another locality. So the research is interesting, it can be important, but it can also be a fairly easy target for defense lawyers. So if you imagine, and that's where my mind, I'm afraid, always goes to, if you can't defend it in a courtroom, you have to ask, should we be doing it? So we may have the most fantastic piece of research that would come out of the taphonomic facility in Tennessee, for example, that determines that we can use this particular method to give us a time-death interval. How long is the individual being dead? If I use that methodology, and I go to the court and say, I believe this person died 3 months, 2 weeks, and 5 days ago because I used this method. A defense lawyer will say to me, how directly applicable is that research done in Tennessee to where this body is being picked up in Lancaster or London or wherever? And if we haven't done comparable studies, then our answer is we don't know. And if we don't know, then the defense lawyers will say, well, if you don't know, why is it in your report? So there's where my problem lies. And certainly, you know, you can find 2 bodies died at the same time, 12 feet apart, but they will decompose in different ways, depending upon, was one of them taking any form of pharmaceutical that the other wasn't? Was one thin and one fat? You know, there are all sorts of variants. And so the science is useful, but I think when you're going to use it in a courtroom, you have to be very, very careful.
That's fascinating. There's another question which is sort of about reliability and rigour. Somebody who's teaching anatomy with an anthropological perspective at a medical school, with an interest in getting involved in forensic anthropology again, recently encountering literature about forensic clinical anatomy, but not sure about its legitimacy. So how do you judge the legitimacy of literature about forensic clinical anatomy? Are there different considerations?
Okay, so if I break that down into its sort of phases, what we're saying is there is the anatomy, which is the understanding of the form and function of the human body. The clinical side of it is saying that we are looking at the body in relation to a recent event, because that's the clinical side of it that will have a medical involvement. And then that case has resulted in going to court, which is what makes it forensic.
Yeah.
It's what I would anticipate we're saying. How that is different from a medic going to court, I'm not sure. So I don't know where forensic clinical anatomy is separated in its definition from a medic going to court to give evidence and information. That just may be my misunderstanding. There's always a possibility that there's a brand new field coming up, and if there is, then you know, forensic anthropology has given you the route that you can follow if you want to get it to the point of certification and credibility in the courts. But I'm always cautious about when the word forensic comes up in front of something else. That forensic bit is the least important bit. Clinical anatomy I get. Applying it to the court doesn't make it forensic clinical anatomy. It just means it's clinical anatomy going into the courtroom. Yeah. Why does it need to be something else? Not sure.
Yeah, okay. One more question about preparing to be a forensic anthropologist. Then I'm gonna come to some questions about you, which sounds fun.
Okay.
Do you know of any courses that specialize in child abuse in relation to forensic anthropology?
So I'm not sure what's the originator of the question quite means. If they're relating to the kind of work that I do, which is about images of child sexual abuse.
Oh, this is a PhD program, sorry, PhD program. From she's already doing an MSc in forensic anthropology and she wants to specialize in child abuse. So she's looking for a PhD program that might be of relevance. So,
and again, if this is on the clinical side of child abuse, then it needs to be into the medical field. So to my mind, that would need to be a medically related PhD, whether it was in clinical psychology, whether it was in forensic pathology, for example, or whether it was, you know, the psychiatry, psychology side, or the behavioral side in terms of psychology and criminology. I think it would have to be broken down a little bit to really know what you mean by looking at a PhD in child abuse, because child abuse is a very big subject. It's like saying I want to do a PhD in physics. What bit of physics? So what aspect of child sexual abuse?
Okay, very fair. Okay, so coming back to you, Jocelyn asks, well, the backdrop is she went to an RAI lecture by you in the British Museum quite a few years ago, where you said something to the effect that you felt like a fraud. Sounds unlikely, but apparently you did.
Absolutely.
Wasn't really an anthropologist, or at least not the kind of anthropologist who's normally addressed in the RAI. Do you feel comfortable in that discipline now and in the RAI?
No, and I think everybody who is really honest suffers from imposter syndrome. So, you know, I chair the council of the RAI, and as I sit in that chair, I feel as if I'm in a grown-up's chair and my feet are dangling off the end, because I don't feel as if I'm really a grown-up in that world. Going into the House of Lords terrifies the living daylights out of me, because everybody else is in there as clever and I don't feel I am. And that imposter syndrome, I think, stays with a lot of people. I think women are worse at it. I think we tend to have more of an imposter syndrome, and we tend not to believe in our own capabilities, irrespective of however anybody tells you anything. My grandmother always said to me, our problem is if 100 people tell you you're pretty and one person tells you you're ugly, you hear one voice and you ignore 100. And I think we do that. We listen to that voice that criticizes us, and that's what makes us feel like imposters. And I still feel like an imposter every single day. I don't feel as if I'm a real academic. I don't feel as if I'm a real anthropologist. I don't feel as if I'm a real expert in anything. And that's not in any way trying to put something on. I end up with dreadful butterflies in my stomach every single time I know I'm going to court, because I think this is the time when they're going to realize that I am that imposter, and all the titles and all the degrees and everything else aren't going to matter, because I'm not going to be able to answer that one question that I should know. It sits with us all.
I think it's so important for people who have such a well-established career as you do, with so many letters after your name, are able to say that. I think it's so reassuring for people, for as you say, it's particularly common, I think, for women, but also other people who face inequality in society.
And I think also, when you look at a CV of someone who gets to my age, and you look at it and think, oh, I'd never do that, never do that, never do that. Yeah, I'll never get there. What you don't see is the alternative CV, which is all the job interviews that you didn't get, all the papers that got kicked out, all the grants that you never got, all the disasters that you had in investigations. They're not there. And I think that negative CV is the really important one for us to write as well, because it's only when you put them together that you get the truth.
I think part of the reason why it's important to hear people like you say that kind of thing is it makes the rest of us feel normal for feeling the same, and also having imposter syndrome. And instead of trying to sort of work our way into a fantasy position where we can get rid of things like nerves or sort of ups and downs in confidence, I think we need to learn to live with them more effectively. Yeah. That's I tell my daughters when they're getting nervous about doing a presentation. Don't get nervous about being nervous.
So I've just noticed that Dean Warren has just asked me a question about whether a strawberry can be declared to be truly dead. And this fits in perfectly with exactly what we're talking about. This was because I went on to the Infinite Monkey Cage with Brian Cox and his crew. And the question was about, when is a strawberry truly dead? And I have never felt so far out of my comfort zone with these comedians and scientists who were so fast, so on the ball, and the speed at which, they were bantering things about them. And I thought, I feel really out of my comfort zone and uncomfortable. And I did do it twice for them because they asked me, but I would never do it again. It's not right for me. And I felt completely at sea.
Yes. So trying to stick to the domains that one feels more comfortable.
Absolutely.
We've only got about 2 more minutes, but somebody's asked what you plan to do when you go to the House of Lords.
So first of all, I plan to keep my head down and to learn the ropes, because I think it's the kind of place where you are in the early stages a real minion in the door. There's so many people in there with so much more experience of the workings of the place that you need to be quiet and invisible and learn. So my intention is not to be too obvious for the first little while, until I can get my feet under the table and become more comfortable. And because, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but because it's a crossbench position, it allows me to be involved in subjects that interest me. So it's not that I'm on a political party where the whip requires me to be there to vote on certain things the way the government or the opposition wants to go. Being a crossbencher, you get that independence. And I can attend in the House of Lords when there are things that I want to vote on, when there are things that I want to talk about, the things that interest me rather than things that I'm directed to do. And I think it will take time to identify what those are. I'm interested in science, obviously. I'm interested in lifelong learning. I'm interested in death and dying and the dignity associated with that. And I think legislation will come back in about assisted dying. So I could see where my role could be there. Justice is an area in which I suspect I may become involved, but I'm also really passionate about ensuring we get women into STEM, and that we ensure that our girls get the same opportunities and our boys get the same opportunities, that we try to find that equity that we need. And there are always subjects where girls will gravitate towards one and boys will gravitate to another. But as long as we've got no barriers that prevent people going where they want to go, where their abilities take them, then I'd like to see those hurdles addressed. So there's lots of things that I think will interest me. The minute it turns into something financial, I'll be asleep on the bench.
That's a fantastic, hopeful note to end on. Not so much the going to sleep bit, but all the brilliant work that we really look forward to hearing about. And I hope you will make use of your committee as well. And if we can help in any way to promote all kinds of anthropology, I really look forward to working with you.
That is very kind of you. And you know what is so lovely is, as I look around the room, seeing people like Catherine Merritt, seeing people like Sam Skeen, folk that I have spent my life working with. That's the most important thing about the subject as well, is that you form a community, and it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you know you can get in touch with those people. And I think anthropology does that, and I think anatomy does that.
Thank you so much, Sue.
It's a pleasure.
Afternoon.
Thank you to everyone. I'm sure you've got much better things to now go and do with the rest of your day, but it's been such a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.